This is UMAR AHMED for IFL TV in association with MTK Global. Over the phone, all the way from Las Vegas, I'm joined by legendary promoter Bob Arum. I know we spoke when this global lockdown had just begun, Bob. How have you been keeping since then?
Well, this is like Groundhog Day. Every morning you get up, and it's the same old. But I'm watching a lot of great television shows, keeping up on the news, talking to my guys in Top Rank, and making do. Nothing you can do about it. I've never had anything like this in my lifetime, and most people, of course, also have never experienced anything like this.
Yeah, definitely a big change for everyone. I don't want to dwell on the situation too much, Bob. We'll talk about boxing. We'll get straight into it. We know both.
Sure.
We know both heavyweight title fights have been postponed. Joshua Pulev to the end of July, and Fury Wilder 3 to October. Do you think that eliminates the chances of getting an undisputed fight this year, Bob?
Well, I would think so. Because I think I've been talking with Eddie Hearn about the Joshua Pulev fight, and I think scheduling it for July is a bit optimistic. I don't think we're going to be able to get clearance, have spectators in the event in July. I would think that fight would go over into the fall, as well as the Fury Wilder fight, which we're now, looking at October. So I think that if the fights play out the way many people think, and Joshua and Fury are the winners, they'll fight sometime next year. I mean, no great catastrophe if they don't fight in December and they fight in January, February of 2021.
Is that why you set Fury Wilder for October? Because July or August just seems too optimistic, Bob?
We had a conference call with the PBC people, and we also talked with the ESPN and Fox, the broadcasters, and I think everybody agreed that we were fooling ourselves if we were going to schedule that fight for the summer. I think the contract says by July, so what we're looking at is around sometime in October if we get the all clear at that point. I think October is certainly much more realistic than July, and if it can't do it in October, maybe November, December. So, I mean, we're keeping track of the situation. The leader in sports in the United States, as far as understanding what has to be done to open up sports, is the basketball people, the NBA, and we're following their lead.
I guess you make a good point about Joshua Pulev, and July does seem optimistic, but another sort of factor in this is top quality sparring. In a lockdown, obviously fighters can't spar because of social distancing, and they need that preparation time to get their full amount of camping and top quality sparring. So that's another issue with Joshua Pulev.
I agree. They need a fight like this. Each of them would need at least 2 months of traditional preparation for a bout of that magnitude. And so therefore, I think as well that for Joshua Pulev, realistically, we'd be looking at October rather than July.
I saw some quotes online that your guy Pulev is willing to donate 50% of his purse for the Joshua fight to help with the post-coronavirus effects, if you like. It's a great gesture.
It's a great gesture. I mean, but, I would caution a lot of these fighters not to get carried away. I mean, it's great to say, I'm going to donate half of my purse to this and that. But, hey, I mean, sometimes these fighters have to live on their purses for long periods of time. They're learning that now. So, while it is a great gesture, and I think he should make some kind of contribution, contributing half of his purse seems to me to be a bit much. But again, we have been assured by everybody that if Joshua beats Pulev and Fury beats Wilder again, that none of the organizations will stand in the way of a massive unification fight.
Okay, that's good to hear that the undisputed fight takes precedence over anything else.
I mean, these organizations do a good job by and large, but one thing is sure, they're not bigger than the sport. And when the sport gets an opportunity like this on the top level, the heavyweights, to unify, as long as that's going to last, I think everybody wants that to happen, and then they can, get together and figure out who the mandatories should be. I mean, Usyk, assuming he wins his next fight, is the WBO mandatory, White is WBC mandatory. Everybody is going to have to be realistic once we get a unified champion to keep that champion, whoever it may be, as long as possible. Got to cut out the nonsense and the politics.
Bob, what can you tell us about any offers made to Deontay Wilder and AHMED regarding step-aside money so Fury Joshua could be made straight away?
Absolutely none. Wilder wants to fight Fury again. He has not indicated to us or anybody else that he will be willing to step aside. There's a further question, who's going to pay him to step aside? And Al and anybody on Al's staff has not even raised the possibilities with us. So as far as we're concerned, we're thinking ahead to a third Fury Wilder fight.
Okay, Eddie Hearn has publicly said there is a deal right now to be made for Fury Joshua. Do you think that is achievable with both Fury and Joshua having other business to take care of first?
No, I mean, Eddie either was misquoted or misspoke. Either one is possible. Because, we're Pulev's co-promoter, and nobody has discussed with us a step aside. We're also involved, obviously, in Fury and Wilder, and there's been no discussions about that. So I don't know what Eddie is talking about, except he's probably bored to death, sitting around like all of us, and so he's, speaking just to speak, really, to keep himself occupied. But at least, and I speak with authority on this because of my relationship with Pulev and my role in Fury and Wilder, that there has been absolutely no discussions by anybody about either of those guys stepping aside.
Okay, moving on from the heavyweight division, Coogan spoke to Terence Crawford recently and they discussed the potential fight with Kell Brook. Is there a strong chance Terence could come to the UK and fight Kell?
I would love that. Right now, nobody knows when you guys will open in the UK, just the way nobody knows when we'll be open for business here in the States. So, yeah, Crawford has a lot of guys to fight. I don't think Spence will go into a fight right away against Crawford. And I think that would probably be delayed maybe until early next year. And Terence always wants to fight the best available guy. And if that is Kell Brook, and we do the fight in the UK. Terence had a very good experience. I think he won his first title in the UK. So he would not be adverse to going over there and fighting Kell Brook in the UK.
Yeah, I remember when he came over here to Scotland and fought Ricky Burns. Very impressive that night. Would love to see him back in the UK. Will you still try to make a fight with one of the PBC guys next, though, forgetting Kell Brook, if you can get a Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, Keith Thurman? Is that what Terence wants?
Well, the question then is, who's going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? I mean, right now, as far as PBC is concerned, as far as Top Rank is concerned, PBC with Fox and Showtime, and Top Rank with ESPN, ESPN Plus, we have a lot of fights to make up for based on our requirement with the television network. So we're going to have to spend a lot of resources doing a lot of fights rather quickly. And therefore, we can't really expend very high amount of resources in doing a fight that's going to require it. I mean, I'd love to do Porter and Crawford, but the question is, how much is it going to cost, and who's going to pay for it? I mean, that question should be asked by all of you guys when you want to see matches. Who is going to pay for the match, and how is the person or entity who is paying for the match going to recoup his money?
I suppose it's only the mega fights which we can see Fox and ESPN collaborating. Is that correct, Bob?
No, I think they would cooperate, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the public is going to buy in. I mean, you take a fight with Terence Crawford and Porter. Well, how much does Porter want? How much does Crawford want? And how are you going to get it back? Particularly if you have some sort of social distancing and you can't sell tickets to the fight. You got to do it with no spectators. I mean, which is maybe a reality. Or even if you can do it for spectators, people are coming off terrible economic burdens. How are they going to afford ticket prices? You know, people who've been out of work for 2 months, where are they going to get the money to buy a ticket to a fight? I mean, all of that has to be taken into account. We don't live in the same bubble that we were in prior to this pandemic.
Will you consider lowering pay-per-view prices?
You're going to have to. Man, I can charge $1,000 a pay-per-view or $100 for pay-per-view or $80. The question is, who's going to pay it? So obviously we're going to have to adjust all prices all across the board, and purses are going to have to be adjusted. I mean, we don't live in a vacuum. We can't go back to what existed before the pandemic and say, well, that's the normal. It isn't anymore.
In terms of that ESPN-Fox relationship, what's your personal relationship with AHMED like now after that Wilder Fury 2 fight in February?
I would say very good. As far as on my part, very good, because we worked seamlessly with his staff. They were good, smart guys and women, and they worked well with us. We were a real team, as were ESPN and Fox. So it worked even better than we could have imagined it when we entered into the deal. So, yeah, I mean, that part is great. So I don't think Al would have hesitancy working with us in the future, nor would we have hesitancy working with his organization in the future.
That's very encouraging to hear. Bob, there are rumours circulating that a clash could happen between Manny Pacquiao and Conor McGregor. Is Crawford-McGregor still a possibility? Because I know you spoke about that before.
Crawford and McGregor is a real possibility. And that's one of the things that we're working on. Now, it would be a possibility if some country or sports authority in the country put up the money for a site fee. Because without a site fee, given the situation that exists now, you couldn't do it. I mean, who's going to pay for it? I mean, as you said before, you're going to have to realistically lower the pay-per-view fees in the United States, which in my opinion were too high to begin with. I mean, the UK pay-per-view numbers seem okay. 20, 25 pounds, 20% goes off the top to the VAT. But in the United States, when we charge $80, you're not going to get it in this climate. So we're going to have to lower the prices, and that's going to require a big site fee from wherever to do a Pacquiao-Crawford fight. If we secure that site fee, I think Pacquiao wants to fight Crawford, and Crawford wants to fight Pacquiao. That's what I've been told.
Do you mean McGregor, Bob? I was talking about Crawford-McGregor.
No, Crawford-McGregor is nonsense.
Oh, okay.
I think the public at this stage is not going to spend money for nonsense. And Crawford-McGregor or Pacquiao-McGregor, they're not real fights. I mean, McGregor is a terrific MMA fighter, but any decent welterweight, any decent fighter will beat McGregor in a boxing ring, and McGregor would beat any decent fighter pretty much in the octagon. So, it's two different sports.
Okay, I asked because before this pandemic started, you did go on record and say you were looking at a 2-fight deal with Crawford in the octagon and McGregor crossing over to the boxing ring. So that's just completely dead now, yeah?
That is completely dead, yes. Look, it's like, you take the tennis player, Federer, tremendous tennis player. You take a golfer, Tiger Woods, tremendous golfer, won the last Masters, right? Now, if you had Federer play Tiger Woods in golf, would Federer have a chance? And you put Tiger Woods on a tennis court with Federer, would Tiger Woods have a chance? It's a different sport. MMA and boxing are different sports.
Sticking with the UFC, Dana White recently had his idea rejected, which involved using a private island to host fights during this global lockdown. What were your thoughts on Dana trying to put on shows during this pandemic still?
Well, I thought that Dana was acting irresponsibly. He tried to forget the island. He tried to put the fight on in an Indian casino, and there's a question of sovereignty of the state and the Indian casinos, which really isn't completely resolved. So he thought he would get that fight off in an Indian casino. But what he wasn't focusing on is the fact that you have medical standards which really pertain on Indian land, the health and safety of the fighters. By that I mean, would they be tested? How would they be tested? There's not enough tests around to test ordinary people. Where are you going to get tests that give you a result in 15 minutes to test all the participants, which means the fighters, the corners, the referee, the judges, the medical personnel, the camera people. You couldn't get those tests. And secondly, even if you got those tests, what happens if a fighter is injured? It happens all the time. And you have to take him to the hospital. Well, that raises two questions. One, in this period of time, when there's a shortage of hospital beds, how do you justify using hospital beds to treat participants in an MMA show? I mean, that's unconscionable. I mean, you take a coronavirus patient, you tell him he has to go in a hall while the doctors take care of an MMA fighter. That would be wrong. And secondly, you got to use ambulances. You know, we're required in an MMA show, a boxing show, to have two ambulances available at one time in case one is used to take a participant to the hospital. You have to have the other. Well, there's a shortage of ambulances here. You need the ambulance to take people who are suffering from the pandemic to hospitals. How do you justify the use of ambulances? All of that stuff wasn't thought out by Dana. I mean, I understand, like I'm a promoter as well. I understand the impatience that we all have about getting back into action. But you've got to do it responsibly. And Dana wasn't acting responsibly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Bob. You make some very valid points. Do you think UFC will ever catch up with boxing? Because we know currently that the purses boxers earn on undercards compared to UFC fighters on undercards are far superior.
Well, you know, they have been able to do a great job at the UFC because they control the talent, the costs of the talent. They have a monopoly or a near monopoly, and that gives them a different business from the ones that we're in. That being said, they have done a tremendous job of promoting MMA, and they've made it into a real business, and they, you know, all accolades and all props to Dana White and his people. They've done a fabulous job promoting the MMA. I mean, we have to, in boxing, acknowledge that.
Fair enough. Bob, I'm sure you often get asked why you're still working, considering you've been in boxing for, 54 years now. But when you look at your current stable, I'll list some of the names. Tyson Fury, Crawford, Lomachenko, Inoue, Josh Taylor, Jose Ramirez, Artur Beterbiev, Teofimo Lopez, Shakur Stevenson. The list doesn't stop. You have most of the best pound-for-pound fighters at top rank right now. It's clear why you're still going. What else drives you?
What else drives me? Are you kidding? I've been home on my ass for over a month, sitting around doing the same thing every day. I mean, once in a while talking to you guys, which at least gives me something to do. If that's what retirement is, I don't want any retirement. I'm going to work till I'm 95 or longer.
You can only admire that, Bob. I want to ask about your memories of promoting Muhammad Ali and specifically starting your journey with him, which I believe was in '66 when he fought George Chuvalo in Canada, the first fight with Chuvalo.
Well, it started in '65, yeah.
Yeah.
It started in '65 when I met him. I mean, he was, you know, a larger-than-life figure. He had a way of communicating with the public that was sensational because he communicated in sound bites that made sense, and people never tired of listening to him or watching him. He was a real, not only performer, but he was a real communicator. And with all of that, he was a genuinely nice, decent person, had very, very good values. So I learned a lot from him because when I started with him, I had obviously no promotional experience. I hadn't seen any fights. And he taught me what it was to be a promoter, how important it was to have a theme and get attention of the public. He was a master at that. So I learned from the best.
Some of the most classic fights in boxing history, Muhammad Ali is involved in them. What's your favourite fight that you promoted of Ali?
Best fight, I mean, there were great fights, but the best fight was the third Ali Frazier fight. I mean, it was in the morning because it was in the Philippines. And so that translated to the evening in New York, so it was in prime time in New York. And that fight was Araneta Coliseum. I remember it now when you talk about it. And it sort of was a dimly lit building. And these two guys, they went at it. Ali dominating Frazier in the beginning. Frazier coming back in the middle rounds, looking like he was going to knock Ali out. Ali towards the end and the late rounds coming back and beating up on Frazier and closing Frazier's eyes where Frazier couldn't continue in the last 15th round. That was the most dramatic fight that I've ever seen. And then after it was over, it was about noon in Manila, to come out in the blazing sunshine. It was unreal. It was an unreal experience. It was something that I'll never forget as long as I live.
Well, I think there's no argument that the Ali-Frazier trilogy is the best rivalry in boxing ever, perhaps even in sport, Bob. Is that a fair comment?
I think so. They were... Ali knew how to press Frazier's buttons. He was pretty cruel to Frazier, but it was an intense rivalry that went on for 5 years. 5 years. There were Frazier fans and Ali fans, and people rooted for each guy the same way. It was over in the UK, and they were football teams where the partisans really root with their whole being. It was the same way with Ali and Frazier.
Okay, back to today's boxing world. I interviewed your future megastar Shakur Stevenson last week. He said that he wants to move to super featherweight once boxing resumes, but was willing to stay at featherweight and travel to the UK to unify with Josh Warrington, who of course recently signed with Eddie Hearn. But of course that fight hasn't materialised, Warrington and Stevenson. Why not, Bob? What happened there?
Coronavirus.
No, in terms of the deal being reached beforehand.
Don't you think? It's a massive fight in the UK. Stevenson has agreed to come over to the UK to fight Warrington. I'm sure Eddie would love to do it. The purses, at least as they were before, were reasonable. There's no reason for that fight not to happen, except for getting the all clear that we can do these events and an event like this requires an audience. You can't do it without an audience because then you can't pay for it.
Bob, I've heard Warrington will face someone else, though, a Chinese fighter, Can Xu. So I don't think that will happen next between Warrington and Stevenson.
Yeah, I'm sure everything can be worked out. I don't know this Can Xu guy, but, I'm sure that we can work out something with him and get on to a fight between Warrington and Stevenson. But we can't do it without spectators.
Yeah, definitely not in the United Kingdom.
And Can Xu probably could go on without spectators and maybe rely on pay-per-view or something like that. But Stevenson and Warrington is too expensive, and that requires, fans in the seats.
I saw some quotes from yourself saying that Shakur will be the next Floyd Mayweather. And what makes you believe that, Bob?
He has the skills of a Mayweather. He's a southpaw Floyd Mayweather. Great defensive abilities. Pretty good offensive fighter. He reminds me a lot of the young Floyd. Remember, we promoted Floyd for 10 and a half years. So I'm familiar with about 30 or 35 of Floyd's early fights. And I realized what a great technician he was. And Stevenson reminds me a lot of that Mayweather.
Talking about Floyd, he seems to be returning to the sport of boxing, but as a trainer, do you think he'll make a good trainer, Bob?
Well, I've always said that when it takes boxing knowledge, when you're talking about knowledge of boxing, from the standpoint of technical knowledge, of the right kind of punches to throw, all that stuff that's probably beyond most fans. But the real technical intricacies of the sport, that Floyd is a genius. He's a master. And I believe that he can communicate a lot of those theories to fighters that he trains. So without knowing for sure, I would think that Floyd would be a master trainer.
Just a last topic to round this interview off. Your pound-for-pound star Lomachenko has been engaging in some trash talk with Devin Haney. If Lomachenko beats Teofimo Lopez, which is a massive if, is that a realistic fight, Lomachenko-Haney? Does that interest you, Bob?
It doesn't disinterest me, but there are probably better fights for Loma or Lopez, whoever wins that fight, than Devin Haney. And I'll give you examples. I mean, Gervonta Davis,
yep,
is a much more well-accepted boxer, but better known than Devin Haney. Also, the Mexican kid from that Oscar has.
Oh, Ryan Garcia?
Ryan Garcia is a much better known, has a much bigger fan base than Devin Haney. So I would think that those fights would take precedent. For the winner of Lomachenko-Lopez would probably want to fight either Ryan Garcia or Gervonta Davis before they fought Haney. Haney really doesn't mean, I'm not talking about his ability. The jury's out on that. He looks like he's a very, very good prospect, but he doesn't have the public support yet that the other guys do. Just doesn't, and you can't paper that over with a big contract that Eddie Hearn gave him. It is what it is. Devin Haney means a lot less in the United States than Ryan Garcia or Gervonta Davis.
In terms of Gervonta Davis, we know he's got a massive profile, as you said, but we haven't seen him yet in a perhaps mega fight, if you like. When do you think they're going to actually put him in a meaningful fight, Bob?
Well, you'd have to direct that to
Mayweather promotion,
Floyd,
yeah,
because Floyd is his promoter. But Floyd knows that whenever he feels Gervonta Davis is ready to fight the winner of Loma Lopez, he'll give us a call and we'll make that match, because Davis has a tremendous following, particularly in the urban community in the United States.
Well, we hope that happens next year. Bob Arum, thank you very much for speaking to IFL TV over the phone from Las Vegas. Look after yourself and hopefully speak soon, Bob.
Good. Nice. Call me anytime, man. I'm looking for things to do.
I'll call you tomorrow, Bob.